the Medici.
Chapter 10. Pietro the Unfortunate.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
On Lorenzo's death, Pietro, the eldest of his 3 sons, succeeded to the headship of the family in the rule of Florence. He himself was 21. His brother Giovanni, who returned from Rome 2 months after Pietro's rule began, was 16, and his brother Giuliano a boy of 13. Pietro was strong, handsome, and excelled in all athletic pursuits, but he gained almost in boyhood the name by which he is always known. It seemed merely to require that he should be a party to any project, for it invariably to fail of success. This peculiarity his qualities of character did not tend to neutralize. He had a heedless temperament, and was more inclined to occupy himself in sport and amusement than in attending to affairs of state, while he was cursed with a haughtiness of disposition which he took no pains to conceal, and which ill accorded with the sentiments of republican Florence. Pietro was not a fool, as often stated. He was simply an ordinary young noble of his day, without more brains than other people possessed. But the Medici had always had more brains than other people possessed. It was expected of them, and they were not wanted by the Florentines as rulers if they ceased to be thus gifted. His wife, Alfonsina Orsini, was just of the character calculated to double the difficulties created by his own faults. She had a full share of the Orsini pride, and by her unconcealed contempt for the Florentines had, even before Lorenzo's death, made herself intensely disliked by them. Seeing how essentially the Medici rule depended upon popularity, Pietro was evidently as unfortunate in the character of the wife who had been given him as in other matters. We now come to an important turning point in the history of the Medici. Whereas each generation of this family had had to encounter a formidable attempt to crush them, storms which they had weathered, there was now to come upon them one destined to involve them in many vicissitudes. Within a year of his succeeding to the rule of Florence, Pietro, chiefly from his disregard of republican forms, and of that attitude of equality with every citizen of Florence which his father had so scrupulously observed, began to be very unpopular. Moreover, this unpopularity was increased by his cousins of the younger branch, Lorenzo and Giovanni, the 2 sons of Pier Francesco. The first 2 generations of the younger branch had evinced no jealousy against the elder branch on account of their more exalted position. But in the 3rd generation we find Pier Francesco's 2 sons, their father having died in 1476, beginning, even in the time of Lorenzo the Magnificent, to grow jealous of the importance of the elder branch, and to show a marked coolness towards them, and this feeling Pietro contrived to excite still more strongly. Towards the end of the life of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Giovanni, who was 4 years older than his cousin Pietro, fell in love with a lady beloved also by the latter. This naturally did not tend to improve matters, nor did a lawsuit instigated by Pietro which was its consequence. Whatever the reasons, these 2 cousins of his now began a regular course of hostility towards him. They fanned his rising unpopularity, headed the party opposed to him, and declared themselves attached to the liberty of the people, which they said he was trying to destroy. It was unfortunate for Pietro that he succeeded to the rule of Florence just when a storm was about to burst upon Italy, with which it would have needed all his father's ability to cope. When death removed the influence of Lorenzo, men foresaw that it would not be long before Italy was again plunged into war. But they did not foresee that to wars between the Italian states were now to be added those due to contests between France, Spain, and Germany, of which Italy would form the battlefield. The event with which this state of things began was the invasion of Italy by Charles VIII of France, in order to attack the kingdom of Naples. Very possibly, had Lorenzo the Magnificent been still at the helm of Italian politics, he would have found means to avert this particular invasion. But sooner or later similar results would have been certain to ensue. For the growing strength of other countries, occurring simultaneously with the decline in power of the Italian states, rendered foreign attacks certain eventually to come upon Italy. And we are now entering on the time when that change was beginning by which, instead of Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, and Rome taking the lead in European politics, France, Spain, Germany, and England were to become the leading countries of Europe. The commencement of this new era in European politics is marked by the accession of the Emperor Maximilian I, who in 1493 was elected emperor on the death, after an uneventful reign of 53 years, of his father, the Emperor Frederick III. Milan. In 1490 the young Duke, John Galeazzo Sforza, came of age. But he being feeble and indolent, his capable uncle Ludovico Sforza, Il Moro, who since 1480 had governed the duchy in his name, refused to surrender the rule to him. John Galeazzo's young wife, Isabella of Aragon, appealed forcibly and continuously to her grandfather, Ferrante, King of Naples, against this usurpation. But up to 1493 the protests of the latter had produced no effect. Some writers have held that it was because Il Moro saw himself about to be attacked by Naples that he invited the French king into Italy. There was, however, no sign that either King Ferrante, who died in January 1494, or his son and successor Alfonso, was preparing any force to attack Milan. Other writers state that Il Moro, having resolved to compass his nephew's death and make himself duke, invited the French invasion in order to stir up trouble which would prevent the other Italian states from interfering with him. Whichever was the reason, Il Moro now invited Charles VIII to attack Naples, and promised him the support of Milan. France. Louis XI, while he had consolidated France, had by his method of doing so crushed to a large extent the spirit of the French nation. Charles VIII, proceeding to rule on different lines from his hated father, had begun to look out for some opportunity for military exploits, both to assist in reviving the spirit of the nation and to gratify his own youthful desire for adventure. When, therefore, Ludovico Sforza urged him to put forward the old Angevin claim to Naples, and to bring an army into Italy to attack that kingdom, Charles eagerly accepted the proposal. French imagination was fired by the idea of an invasion of Italy. All classes caught it up with enthusiasm, and preparations on a great scale were forthwith made for an expedition which to the French had all the attraction of novelty and romance. This expedition of Charles VIII has a special importance of another kind, for this was the first exercise of the new power created by a standing army, a power destined to create great political changes in Europe. Hitherto, the armies of such countries as France and England had consisted of the feudal levies brought to the standard of the king by the barons, and the necessity of humoring the caprices and ever-recurring jealousies of the latter, when such a force was gathered together, greatly nullified its offensive power. These conditions tended to prevent wars being undertaken against other countries, since they made the invasion of another country, far from the homes of such levies, a most difficult operation. But the new weapon which had been forged by Louis XI, primarily as a means of crushing the barons and princes of France, had altered all this, and while making the king supreme over his barons, had also put in his hand a formidable weapon against other countries. Thus it is not surprising that we find historians stating that Charles VIII, who had no ability of his own, was at this time the most powerful sovereign in Europe. The reason was because he alone was in possession of this new weapon, which his astute father had had the wit to forge, and which no other country as yet possessed. There was, however, one other point in which a standing army differed materially from a feudal army, viz., in the item of cost. Charles VIII's army, which included infantry, artillery, and cavalry, did not consist of more than about 20,000 men, though this was a great effort for those times. But so little had the increased cost of such an army been realized, that before it had penetrated any distance into Italy, Charles found his treasury exhausted, and had to borrow large sums from the merchants of Genoa at the ruinous rate of interest of 42%. In August 1494, Charles VIII started from Vienne to invade Italy. Crossing the Alps, he entered Lombardy, and was entertained at Milan by Il Moro, and at Pavia by the Duke John Galeazzo, and there the latter's wife, the beautiful and unfortunate Isabella of Aragon, threw herself at the French king's feet to intercede for her house, which he was marching to attack. But she gained nothing, and a few days later, on reaching Piacenza, Charles received the news that the Duke was dead, poisoned, it was universally believed, by his unscrupulous uncle, Il Moro, who at once imprisoned Isabella and her 4 children, and notwithstanding that the late Duke had left a son and heir, proclaimed himself Duke of Milan. Meanwhile, the other states of Italy prepared as best they might to meet this invasion. Naples, against whom the attack was directed, awaited it in her own territory. Rome made no preparations for defense, the Pope hoping that Charles would not molest him. Venice declared herself neutral. Tuscany, having no particular reason to espouse the cause of Naples, would no doubt have liked to have done the same, but lying right in the course of the French king's march, was obliged to defend her territory. And Tuscany was ill prepared. The many years of peace had worked their usual effect in a want of preparedness for war. And to Pietro's difficulties on this account were added others. His disloyal cousins Lorenzo and Giovanni seized upon this opportunity, and at a time when all private feuds should have been sunk, made their country's need the occasion for gratifying their private jealousy. They sent secret assurances to Charles VIII that they would promote his views, and would assist him with money, of which, as has been seen, he was much in need. This action of theirs was discovered, and they were arrested by Pietro's orders. No one could have been surprised if they had been executed as traitors to their country, or at all events imprisoned. Pietro, however, followed the example which his grandfather, Piero il Gottoso, had set, and behaved very leniently toward them, simply confining them, Lorenzo to the villa of Cafaggiolo, and Giovanni to the walls of Castello. They repaid him by escaping thence, going to Charles VIII, who was then at Vigevano, and assuring him that the Florentines would ally themselves with him against Naples, if only he would help them to get rid of Pietro. By this time Charles's army was entering the borders of Tuscany, and laying siege to its frontier fortresses, which were defended by such mercenary troops as Pietro had been able to collect. But these troops, being quite unfit to cope with such an army, failed to arrest the French. The frontier fortress of Sarzana, which Charles attacked at the end of October, was soon captured, and the French king continued his advance. Pietro had now only 2 courses open to him. He has been spoken of with contempt by all writers for his action in this crisis, but whether this view is correct seems open to question, as it would appear to have scarcely sufficiently considered the problem before Pietro. On the fall of Sarzana, the only 2 alternatives possible to him were either to be prepared to sustain a siege of Florence by the French army, or to endeavor, by a partial surrender, to induce the French king to pass peaceably through Tuscany, avoiding the capital. The first course meant inevitably, in view of the complete disparity in military power between the organized army which Charles commanded and Florence's mercenary levies, the assault and sack of Florence by foreign troops. Had the French king been attempting to conquer Tuscany, the matter would have been different, and Florence would have been bound to resist to the end and to fall with honor. But this was not the case. The French king had no special quarrel with the Florentine state, so that the sack of the city would have been endured on behalf of another state which had no claim upon Florence for such a sacrifice, and which, though principally concerned, had no force to join with her in opposing the French king. Pietro therefore chose the second course, and in order to persuade Charles VIII to accept terms and pass without further aggression through Tuscany by the coast road which avoided Florence, went off in person to the camp of the King of France to try and achieve this by a personal interview. He there saw for the first time what a regular organized army was like, and, if he had not done so before, must have realized at once how futile would be any opposition which Florence could offer to such a force, and that it could only have a result which he was bound at all costs to prevent. The French king agreed to pass peaceably through Tuscany, but would not consent to avoid the capital, and required, as the condition on which Florence should be spared from assault and her territory from devastation, that Pisa and the fortresses of Sarzana, Sarzanello, Ripafrata, and Pietrasanta should be held by him until the conquest of Naples had been completed. Most of these places were already in Charles's possession, while it was only a question of days before all would be so, and he had power to hold them for as long as he chose, so that Pietro in agreeing to these terms did not make any very great concession. Pietro returned to Florence on the 8th November in expectation that the citizens would be thankful, under the circumstances, for what he had achieved. But the seeds so assiduously sown by his cousins at last bore fruit. The citizens had not seen Charles's army, and did not know their own weakness and the French king's strength. Their pride was wounded by the idea of the surrender of fortresses, and the combined result brought matters to a climax. Pietro was met by a storm of indignation. The measure of his unpopularity was now full, and there was a general clamor for his banishment and that of his whole family. The Signoria assembled, and promptly passed a decree banishing the Medici permanently from the state of Florence, 9th November 1494. This banishment was not carried out in the dispassionate manner of that in Cosimo's time. They were driven to fly from the city for their lives, and the Signoria subsequently offered a reward of 4,000 florins for the head of Pietro, and 2,000 florins for that of his brother Giovanni, while the mob were permitted by the government to plunder the Medici palace, which we are told was sacked from roof to cellar. And so, notwithstanding all that the Medici had, during 100 years, expended from their private fortune to benefit the citizens of Florence, there were now robbed from them, and scattered to the four winds, all those treasures of art gathered with so much diligent labor by Cosimo Pater Patriae, Piero il Gottoso, and Lorenzo the Magnificent, a greater collection of art treasures than was to be found in any other single building in Europe. The destruction of this invaluable collection is pathetically related by the scholarly Bernardo Rucellai in a long lament over the priceless treasures, both of learning and art, destroyed on this occasion. In the former category were valuable manuscripts in every language, collected at great expense, and most of them quite unable to be replaced. Not less deplorable was the loss in the domain of art. Irrespective of pictures and statues which were plundered, many valuable pieces of ancient sculpture, exquisite gems, cameos, vases, and countless specimens of the work of the minor arts were destroyed, sharing in a general ruin which reduced a palace which had been the admiration of every foreign visitor, and the chief ornament of the city, to the condition of one sacked by an enemy's troops. The contemporary French historian, Philippe de Comines, after giving a long list of the valuable things lost in this great act of vandalism, computes that, over and above what was carried off, the money value of what was destroyed represented more than 100,000 crowns. All that energetic labor and artistic taste had collected in half a century was dispersed or destroyed in a day. We have a glimpse of one item among these plundered treasures 8 years later, viz., the 4 valuable vases which had belonged to Lorenzo, and which we find, in 1502, offered for sale in Florence. Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, writes in that year requesting that Leonardo da Vinci, who was then in Florence, would inspect them for her, as she heard they were for sale, and would send her a report on them and the price at which they were valued. Leonardo, having examined them, was in ecstasies over their beauty. He reported that all four had Lorenzo's name engraved in Roman letters on the body of the vase, and as to the prices at which they were to be obtained, said, "The crystal vase, all of one piece and very fine, is valued at 350 ducats. The jasper vase, of variegated colors and encrusted with pearls and rubies on a gold stand, at 240 ducats. The agate vase at 200 ducats, and the jasper vase on a silver stand at 150 ducats." They were evidently too costly an ornament for the Marchioness of Mantua, and she did not buy them. They therefore remained in Florence, and some 50 years afterwards were sought out and repurchased by Cosimo I, and are now in the gem room of the Uffizi Gallery. One of the statues taken from the Medici Palace was made to serve as a monument of this casting forth by Florence, in ignominy and ruin, of the family which had so long made that city's greatness. The Signoria took from amongst the plundered works of art the bronze statue of Judas slaying Holofernes, executed by Donatello for Cosimo Pater Patriae, which had always stood in the centre of the cortile of the palace, and set it up in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, engraving an inscription round its base, declaring it set up as a warning to all who should think to tyrannize over Florence. The inscription was a fine sounding one, and helped, as was intended, to justify the action of those who had cast forth Pietro and his family, because he had been unable to protect Florence from a foreign aggression with which they themselves were just as little able to cope. But it gave no real picture of the case. Pietro had in no sense tyrannized over Florence. He had not the power to do so, and he had never committed any act which showed that he even had the wish. All that he had done was to offend her republican sentiments by what the citizens called a haughty demeanor. In after years, when a real tyrant came to rule over them, they were to find by most bitter experience how very different a thing tyranny was from the matters, chiefly of mere outward behaviour, which had called forth their complaints against the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. When, with their signoria abolished, they groaned under the tyranny of Cosimo I, with the utmost joy would they have welcomed back the free and untrammelled existence which they had enjoyed under the rule of Pietro the Unfortunate. The members of the family who were thus hurriedly driven forth from Florence were the three brothers, Pietro, then 23, Giovanni, 18, and Giuliano, 15, with their first cousin Giulio, 16, also Pietro's wife, Alfonsina, and their two infant children, Lorenzo and Clarice. They fled first to Bologna and thence to Venice, where they obtained a temporary asylum. Pietro's ignoble second cousins, Lorenzo and Giovanni, were not included in the decree of banishment. They gained immunity for themselves by abandoning, for a time, to their permanent discredit, the name of Medici, and taking instead the name of Popolano, erasing the family arms from the outside of their palace. 60 years had passed since the Medici had last been cast out with ignominy from Florence. They were now for the second time to suffer the hardships of exile. The sentence passed against them furnished an example of how evanescent is popular favour and the memory of public benefits. All the deliverance of his countrymen from unjust taxation and the tyranny of the nobles effected by Giovanni de Medici, all the unwearied generosity of 30 years which had won for Cosimo the title of Father of his Country, all the prosperity of Florence wrought by Lorenzo, were forgotten as completely as though they had never been. And the edifice founded by Giovanni de Medici, gradually built up by Cosimo, strengthened by the qualities of Piero, and perfected by the ability of Lorenzo, fell in ruins. The Medici were back again at the point they had occupied before Giovanni de Medici began to lay the foundations of the family greatness, but with the additional obstacle to their ascending the ladder again, that now, by the combined effect of Pietro's failure to follow the line of conduct laid down by his father, and the disaffection stirred up by his cousins, their popularity was gone, and the citizens were determined to keep them out of Florence for the future. This second banishment meant the entire ruin which had been aimed at, but not achieved, in the first. The change in their circumstances was most complete. The numerous activities of public life, which for 4 generations had become the accustomed occupations of this family, their patronage of art and letters, the social pleasures of an exalted station and great wealth, all were at an end. And, deprived of all their possessions, they went forth to lead a nomadic and poverty-stricken existence for 18 years. Pietro spent all the remaining 9 years of his life in fruitless endeavors to get himself reinstated in Florence by force of arms, not seeing that this was just the way to defeat his object, by setting the Florentines still more against him. His father, had he found himself in a like position, would have left no stone unturned to make the Florentines recall him voluntarily. But Pietro lacked his father's wisdom, and so turned to those measures which could by no possibility obtain for him success. He became a pawn on the political chessboard, to be used whenever any state found itself in opposition to Florence. And in this way various states in turn lent him troops, with which he made 3 successive attempts against Florence, which all proved abortive. In these endeavors the Medici brothers wandered from state to state in Italy, but after 5 years of failure, which rightly or wrongly they attributed to Pietro's proverbial misfortune, his 2 brothers and their cousin Giulio separated themselves from him, declaring that they should never succeed while combined with him. Having already sought the protection, in turn, of most of the states of Italy, and finding themselves becoming regarded as troublesome refugees, the trio, Giovanni, Giuliano, and Giulio, determined to abandon Italy for a time, and in 1499 started on a wandering tour to traverse the principal countries of Europe. They went first into Germany, where on reaching Ulm they were arrested and sent under a guard to the Emperor Maximilian, who, however, released them and treated them well, complimenting Giovanni on bearing his adverse fortune with patience, and on his prudence in employing the time which was thus at his disposal in gaining a knowledge of foreign countries. Experiencing various adventures, and being several times detained in custody, they visited, during the years 1499 and 1500, most of the principal cities in Germany, Flanders, and France, and desired to have visited England, but were prevented by adverse weather from crossing the sea. Returning through France, they at length arrived at Marseilles, whence they proceeded to Genoa, where they resided with Giovanni's sister, Maddalena Cibo. From Genoa, after a time, they proceeded to Rome, where Alexander VI, having now cause of offence against Florence, laid aside his previous ill will and treated them with consideration. Meanwhile, Pietro, finding no more help obtainable elsewhere, had joined himself to the French, and in 1501 received a vague promise of assistance from Louis XII, which, however, came to nothing. Eventually Pietro, unfortunate to the last, accompanying the French army in their campaign in southern Italy, was, during the confusion of the retreat towards Gaeta after their disastrous defeat on the Garigliano, upset in the boat in which he was conveying down the river to Gaeta 4 pieces of heavy artillery which he had saved from capture by the enemy, and was drowned, December 1508. Botticelli has painted a well-known portrait of Pietro, which hangs in the Uffizi Gallery, and, as he knew him well, it is certain to be a good likeness. He has dark brown hair, and the remarkably fine eyes which, through many generations, were a noted characteristic of his family, while his face has a melancholy expression attributable to his invariable ill fortune. He wears a scarlet cap, and holds in both hands a medallion of his great-grandfather Cosimo, appealing to the people of Florence by the memory of him to whom they had themselves given the title of Father of his Country, not to treat his descendants as they were doing. This portrait, always known to be by Botticelli, was formerly thought to represent Pico della Mirandola, while another suggestion has in recent years been made that it represents Giovanni, the son of Cosimo, who died in 1468. As, however, Giovanni died as a man of 42, when Botticelli was only 19, it is sufficiently obvious that the portrait, which represents a man of 24 or 25, cannot be that of Giovanni. It undoubtedly represents Pietro the Unfortunate, and has been correctly so labeled by the authorities of the Uffizi Gallery. The medallion held up in the hands and presented to the spectator, and forming the most prominent feature of the picture, is by itself sufficient to be absolutely convincing on the point, for that particular appeal to the memory of Cosimo Pater Patriae would be quite meaningless as regards either Pico della Mirandola or Giovanni. It would, in fact, not be applicable in the case of anyone else than Pietro the Unfortunate. The picture was evidently painted a year or two after Pietro's banishment, either for himself or one of the exiled Medici party. Botticelli, being the court painter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and almost living in the family, had known Pietro from the latter's very childhood, and owing, as he did, all his career, first to Piero il Gottoso, and afterwards to Lorenzo, undoubtedly sympathized much with the family in being driven from Florence, and mourned over the destruction of all their art treasures and the ruin of this great house. The feature of the medallion is just such a touch as Botticelli delighted to introduce in order to make his picture tell its own story. Having seen the Medici, in the 5th generation of the family, banished for the second time from their country, and before we enter on those 18 years in which Florence lost all the power and prosperity she had enjoyed for 60 years, we may take a brief glance at what this family had achieved during the first 100 years of their course, and may also examine how far the two charges which have been referred to are justly to be made against them, so far as this portion of their history is concerned. Looking back at the position in the year 1400, there appears to be two grounds on which, irrespective of more personal considerations, the Medici justly deserve fame. First, their raising Florence to so exalted a position, and second, the results they accomplished in the domain of learning and art. From a petty state, which did not exceed in power and influence many others around it, the Medici had gradually raised Florence until she had become practically the capital city of Italy, not only exceeding in power the other states, such as Pisa, Lucca, Siena, Mantua, Ferrara, Urbino, and others, which had formerly been her equals, but also as a city surpassing in grandeur, prosperity, and intellectual eminence even Rome, Venice, Milan, and Naples. And out of Italy, no city at that time could compete with these. When on the banishment of the Medici the army of Charles VIII entered Florence, we are told they saw a city which immeasurably surpassed any at that time in France, and could not contain their astonishment at the grandeur of its palaces and public buildings, and the culture and refinement of its inhabitants, which they admitted to be far superior to their own. But the second point is of far wider importance. The Medici have a just right to fame for the permanent benefits which they conferred on mankind at large by their fostering care over learning and art, and their readiness to expend a colossal fortune upon these things in an age before men had yet fully learnt to appreciate their value. This liberality was specially important in regard to the resuscitation of learning, since this was a work which could not have been carried out without an expenditure such as the Medici alone, among families of that period, could afford. And it was well for mankind that the Medici, through 4 generations, were ready to shower their wealth, not upon the ostentatious display of riches which was common enough around them, but upon the resuscitation of learning and the advancement of art. Europe today reaps the result of this their character, and owes them immeasurable gratitude for all that they did, and were, in this particular. Turning to examine the charge that the Medici deprived their country of its liberty, and exalted themselves into tyrants over it, it would appear that this charge involves considerable wresting from their proper meaning of both the word liberty and the word tyrant. The only liberty which the Medici took away was the freedom to indulge in an internecine strife which made life in Florence one perpetual faction fight, a state of things under which no previous government had been able to protect the lives and property of the citizens. With no due degree of liberty did the Medici rule interfere, and life in Florence in their time was as free as in any modern state. While, as regards the word tyrant, it is sufficient to observe that a tyranny cannot exist without a bodyguard of troops to support and protect the ruler when his acts are tyrannical or opposed to the will of the people. Wealth alone cannot create a tyranny, for even should it go to the length of purchasing the suffrages of the majority of the citizens, its power still remains based upon the votes of the majority, and the minority, even though they may have much to say regarding the means by which these have been obtained, cannot call such a power a tyranny without misuse of terms. The Medici rule rested solely on popularity, and a rule which rests on that basis has no power to tyrannize. This was fully proved when, 2 years after Lorenzo's death, and simply because the popularity which had formed the sole basis of his power was lost, Florence, with only a word, sent his successor and his whole family into exile. The usual theory put before us regarding the Medici is that it was by craft and dissimulation that they rose to power in Florence. It was not so. Nor amongst a people so abnormally well versed, through 200 years of political intrigue, in every form of craft and dissimulation could that method ever have succeeded. There was no race in Europe with whom it would have so surely failed. It was by the display of a preeminent ability in the conduct of public affairs. It was by a large-minded magnanimity constantly evinced in their dealings with those brought in contact with them. It was by their defense of the people against the oppression of the nobles, by their freedom from arrogance, their clemency in victory over crafty and ungenerous foes, and a generosity which knew no bounds in spending their private wealth for the benefit of their fellow countrymen. It was by these qualities that the Medici rose to power in Florence. And we have this corroborated by Voltaire, who says of the Medici that "no family ever obtained power by so just a title," a statement which one such as Voltaire would certainly never have made had they obtained it either by force or by craft. With regard to the second of the two charges, it is truly a most significant fact when we find that, amidst all the virulent abuse which has been poured forth by so many pens during 3 centuries upon these 5 generations of the Medici, no accusation of murder has ever been made against either Giovanni de Medici, Piero il Gottoso, Lorenzo the Magnificent, or Pietro the Unfortunate. So that if we accept the single case of the accusation made by Cavalcanti against Cosimo Pater Patriae of complicity in the death of Baldaccio d'Anghiari, which is rejected by all reliable historians, the whole 5 generations of the Medici, whose lives are covered by these 100 years, are free from any charge of murder. Yet this is during a period, 1400 to 1508, specially notable for such crimes, and when the records of almost all other states show a long catalogue of thoroughly authenticated murders committed by their rulers. It is said to be the just penalty of greatness to endure severer criticism than is applied to others, and certainly the Medici may be held to exemplify the fact. The history of that time is full of cases of families who were seizing upon thrones and wading through blood to gain them, without any higher object than that of enriching themselves. Yet the Medici, who took a more patriotic course, while they certainly evinced, however its degree may be disputed, a higher aim, have been criticized and condemned as these others have never been. The accusation that they made themselves despots in order to extract from a downtrodden people wealth to spend upon themselves, has been made of a family whose liberality in spending their private fortune upon matters for the public benefit exceeded all that has been elsewhere known in history. It was not the Florentines, but the citizens of London and Paris, Lyons and Bruges, Genoa and Venice, who supplied the income which the Medici spent, to so limited an extent upon themselves, and to so large an extent upon Florence. Nor will the assertion that they destroyed the liberties of Florence in order to exalt themselves into despots continue to be tenable when their rule is compared with that set up at this same epoch by Louis XI in France, or by Henry VII in England, or when we note that the citizens of Florence enjoyed under the Medici a far greater degree of representative government than the people of either France or England. Had not the Medici established the kind of rule they did, the Pazzi, the Capponi, the Strozzi, and others would have headed various factions, as the Donati, the Cerchi, and the Albizzi had done before them, and none of that internal peace and prosperity, that national importance and cultured eminence would have resulted which Florence was so thankful to possess while it lasted, and so proud to look back upon after it had passed away. Nor does a wider outlook fail to give evidence on the same point. Throughout the greater part of the 15th century, the rule of the Medici, by its suppression of internal strife, the consequent increase of weight in internal politics, and the powerful assistance given to learning and art, produced results to Florence which were the envy of all surrounding states. And the failure of the latter to advance in a similar way, both politically and in art, has been directly attributed to the absence of any family with the capacity to do for them what the Medici did for Florence. Thus, as regards art, it has often been pointed out that up to the time when the Medici arose, Siena, for instance, was on a level with Florence, but from that time forward could no longer compete with her. While, as regards politics, it has been remarked by Professor Langton Douglas that Siena, hitherto equal in power to Florence, was left behind by the latter, owing to that faction fighting which the Medici rule made impossible in Florence. We see, therefore, that to the very fact for which, on behalf of Florence, the Medici have been condemned, other states have attributed all Florence's greatness.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.